So it's been a couple of weeks since the CrowdStrike issue. The airlines are flying again. I want to talk about what happened and why, but not necessarily from a technical perspective. I actually want to talk about what happened and why from a risk management perspective. So it's going to be sort of a step back, and we are going to go back in time all the way to 2009. So stay tuned. The first thing I want to call out is that when we make software choices like this, when companies purchase CrowdStrike, we are making social choices, not just rational actor software choices. And that really matters when you're talking about something like security, because getting security right, if you are the CIO or CTO of a major airline or a hospital or a major utility or whatever it was, that is a choice that could get you fired. And you always are aware of it when you're making that decision. And as much as people have come into my comments saying, hey, this is really something where the CTO or the CIO did not do enough due diligence, I actually want to push back. This is not really a function of due diligence, because before the outage that happened, this was the premier solution. CrowdStrike was the solution that a responsible CTO or CIO would choose in order to make sure that they were doing the right thing and be perceived as doing the right thing in their job. It is social. Because if you're going to your CEO and you're presenting, this is our security solution, you want to be presenting something where the CEO can talk to his buddies at the golf course and they're like, oh yeah, CrowdStrike, it's good. Like, that's fine. And if you think I'm making that up, that is actually how a lot of it works. That is actually how a lot of those decisions get made. And so, yes, you can come up with 3 PowerPoint bullets from CrowdStrike that make it really easy to pick CrowdStrike. Absolutely. You can put a rational case together if you're a CIO or a CTO. Super easy. In fact, there's lots of cases to be made just by reading the CrowdStrike website. The CrowdStrike sales rep is happy to help you. It's a very easy set of cases to make. If you were to pick anything else in the industry before the outage, the CEO would ask you lots of questions. They would want to be sure. Why are we not going with CrowdStrike? I Googled and CrowdStrike is the industry leader. I checked on LinkedIn and CrowdStrike is something that all of my friends are using as CEOs. Why not CrowdStrike? And so it's a socially driven choice, and that means that we converge onto particular solutions that are socially approved, whether or not the actual risk profile is managed. And that's going to be a theme as we see. So the first piece is that software choices are social choices, and that works in the C-suite in ways that drive convergence regardless of risk. The second point is that risk is not effectively managed by existing audit mechanisms. So that's a fairly technical phrase. So let me break it out. Fundamentally, an audit process is run off of a particular imagined risk profile. It's a linear process, and auditors like to work against that linear process. They have a way of doing things. If they are used to auditing your tech solution, as they were with CrowdStrike, it is a much simpler audit process. You, the CTO or CIO, go through less pain. The auditor goes through less pain because everybody has done this before. And so the auditor comes in and says, yes, I've seen CrowdStrike. This is what we do with CrowdStrike. If you do other solutions, it's not the same thing. They open up the big book, right? They have to go through their process again. The auditor is vaguely annoyed. You, the CTO or CIO, probably have more work. It is a non-trivial difference simply because CrowdStrike was more familiar to auditors. And again, that isn't actually speaking about their risk. It's just saying that the auditor had a set of processes they were familiar with running. They had a set of checks that they were familiar with running. They had a set of shorthand that they had developed around this company because they'd seen it installed so many times, the software installed so many times across technical footprints at major companies. And so there's an incumbency advantage that goes with that. There's a sense of we're here to stay, we're the responsible actor, and you see it in a lot of regulated industries where effectively the governmental audit process or the governmental regulatory process anoints a market leader, regardless of whether that market leader has actually dealt with the real risks underneath the hood. And we saw with CrowdStrike that wasn't actually true. They hadn't actually addressed the risks. That's the second takeaway, is that fundamentally audits don't really de-risk if the imagined risk model is static and if it's applied in a way that sort of uses a shorthand for a market leader. And that's typically what happens. The third thing I want to call out is that our imagined risk model is something that we have a really hard time handling as a species over a long period of time. And I'm going to give you, this is where we go back in time. In the early 2000s, Microsoft had a long-running antitrust case with the European Union, and they finally settled in 2009. And one of the things they agreed to is that security companies could have the same access to the Microsoft kernel as Microsoft did. This bug came from the kernel access that the EU pushed Microsoft to grant to security companies. And the reason why this happened fundamentally is that the EU could not imagine a world where a security company would be not necessarily a bad actor, but an incompetent actor. There was an imagined risk model of the world that didn't match the real risk model, and so externalities happened after the settlement that nobody anticipated. The EU thought, you know what, if we give security companies access to the kernel, we're going to make for a fairer, less monopolistic world. And security companies have grown and thrived in that environment, but it's also opened up risks that we all have to live with. And it is one of the root causes that led to the outage. Now, it's not as simple as saying, well, the EU shouldn't have regulated it, because if you listen to the earlier conversation here, one of the earlier points around sort of audits and how audits tend to anoint market leaders, governmental action that drives monopolistic tendencies in these kinds of security or regulated environments can also accelerate risk. And so part of the problem here is that we have auditory action that increased concentration of risk on this vulnerable player in the system, CrowdStrike. And so there's this sort of monopolistic gathering of risk, of customer trust around this one company driven by governmental action and audits. At the same time, governmental action designed to decrease monopolistic tendencies by giving other companies access to the Microsoft kernel was another root cause of this whole mess. It is really, really hard for people who are trying to understand and design laws, regulations, audit practices, best practices around market participation. It's hard for them to anticipate long-term, long-tail externalities. So in other words, if it's a long-tail externality, it is something that has a very small percentage chance of happening, but if it happens, it's going to be a big deal. And it will not happen over a determinate period of time. The ruling came down in 2009, and here we are in 2024, and all of a sudden there's been a massive outage, and Delta has reported $500 million in costs associated with this bug. And there's many other players, right? Delta just reported it. I want to call that out because this is not about blaming a particular player. It's about understanding how the players work together so that we can figure out how to de-risk these systems better. We need audit systems that actually match to real risk models. We need regulatory systems that do a better job imagining worst case scenarios over the long term. We also need social dynamics in the C-suite that reward people for critical thinking. Those three things would have made a big difference on the CrowdStrike bug. What else do you think is a root cause here that I didn't talk about?